Oh, looks like we're live. Well, welcome everybody. We're just kicking off our third live event for Unit 1 of Connected Courses. Last week we had a lot of conversation about the whys of our teaching, of our courses, and in particular, I think a lot of the discussion has centered around the question of what do we do to really develop learning environments that are purpose-driven rather than content-driven in focus. And so for this session, we're staying on that theme, but shifting gears a little bit to talk about topics that are really at the core of educational research and somewhat more research-centered around how, as educational researchers, but also as faculty, can we really reflect on, capture, describe the sort of unique learning outcomes that come from a more purpose-driven, socially connected, maybe project-based kind of course that many of us are trying to design. And I'm really excited today that we're joined by two of my mentors in educational research, Vera Michaelchik and Bill Penuel, who have really been close collaborators in the Connected Learning Research Network to think about issues of educational assessment, outcomes, and research, but doing it in a way that I think is really true to our core values, our approaches in connected learning, and that differ in some really important ways with how a lot of educational assessment is done. And so I know that a lot of this is on the more research geekery side of things, but I do think it has really important implications for our practice as faculty and as educators, and the kinds of stories we want to tell about what kids get out of the learning that we're trying to promote in our connected courses. So both Vera and Bill are members of the Connected Learning Research Network that I'm part of. That's part of the larger Digital Media and Learning Initiative. Vera is at Stanford at the Center for Teaching and Learning. She's Senior Associate Director for Learning Sciences and Technology, recently moved there from SRI. Bill also used to be at SRI, but moved a few years ago to the University of Colorado Boulder to the School of Education there. And again, they're both leaders in thinking both broadly but also in the trenches about how we really change the conversation around outcomes and assessment. So again, I'm really delighted to be able to host a conversation with them today. I wanted to start, on the theme of one of the prompts in connected courses. We've been talking about the why of our teaching. I wanted to let Bill and Vera introduce themselves by talking a bit about the why of their research, their stories of how they came to the progressive approaches to educational research that they've been so engaged in throughout their careers, and what they think the stakes are in pursuing this approach to outcomes and assessment and documentation of learning. So I don't know, Bill, do you want to start us off here?
Sure. Thanks, Mimi. And I'm glad that you learned from us, because we certainly learned from you. And I think that's part of the spirit of this kind of class, too. So I was really fortunate. I feel like one of the formative experiences for me early in my career was to get an experience of shared purpose that was really powerful very early on. And also to do so in a context where I had the task as part of this endeavor that I was part of evaluating something and having to think hard about how I would do so. So the particular experience that I'm referring to happened when I was in my early 20s and working with the state of Massachusetts as part of their Department of Public Health network. And that network actually sponsored a youth and adult co-planned conference every summer that brought together young people from different racial backgrounds, different classes, gay and straight kids together who were in alliances from both rural and urban areas of Massachusetts together for a 4-day retreat setting that focused on diversity and violence prevention. And the really powerful part of this was the co-planning of this event so that it reflected the joint and common purposes of adults and young people to promote youth development, but also the power of what would come out of that. So what was expected is that after the retreat that brought hundreds of kids together, young people, and as part of that, they would develop action plans in their communities for carrying out violence prevention or diversity promotion activities. And so in my role as an evaluator, I had to think hard about, well, how would I evaluate this and the opportunities that the co-planning process has for young people and adults for mutual learning. And so I needed a framework from the get-go that would help me think about that. I also needed to think about, well, what would be the result of the young people actually taking action in their communities? What would also be a good outcome of their experience in the particular setting? And very quickly you move away from the idea of I'm going to measure some concrete outcomes that I know ahead of time that the young people are going to experience, and towards a more model of making some observations about how people were participating, how their roles shifted over time, and how they took on more responsibility within the setting for different aspects of the work. And especially as these young people migrated from planners to being youth staff at the workshop, how did they take these roles on with using what kinds of language for describing and interacting with other young people? So issues of power and authority came up from the get-go. And then out into the community. So how would we evaluate these joint endeavors that were not oriented just towards changing people's individual behavior, but making a difference in their community? So from the get-go, I've thought and continue to think about what are the outcomes that groups can accomplish, and accomplish not only for themselves and providing an experience that's very powerful for them, but also in making a difference in their communities. So that's really the perspective that I think animates my work today in both assessment and in evaluation.
Thanks, Bill. That's a great story. How about you, Vera?
Yeah, I think I'll be like Bill and go way back to my roots and mention that I started off thinking that I wanted to study personal epistemologies, what it was that people understood about themselves as learners and what they took learning to be on a personal level. And it became quickly apparent to me that what we needed to talk about were situational or institutional cultural epistemologies, how the learning environment really shapes what it is that how it is that people experience themselves as knowers and learners. And I think Bill's work was in Massachusetts, and my early work was at the other side of the world. I was on a small island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, an island called Koshrai, where I really went to look at how different institutional frames really created the knowing subject as a different kind of person depending on what the purpose of the institution was. And let me be a little more concrete. On that island, traditional practices had carried on for millennia, and well, not on that island, but for centuries on that particular island, and family practices where children were inducted into ways of knowing and being were continuous with pre-contact time. The island was heavily depopulated after contact with Western whalers, and missionaries stepped in and created an institutional culture around the church that to this day, and this is the important piece here, really is responsible for literacy rates that are quite near to 100%. And then school is a relative newcomer to the institutional order, various institutional orders on the island. But the interesting thing to me, and Bill talked about taking place within a community and supporting the greater purpose. In the family, the learning that took place was really in service to survival, whether it was farming or feeding the pigs or caring for babies. There was an apprenticeship model that supported the growth of these capacities from the time children were quite small, obviously, and what the outcomes were really about what one could do next. There were experiences strung together. One experience became the basis for potential taking up of opportunities to serve that order in subsequent moments and subsequent times. In the church, where we saw again, which is responsible for the incredibly high rates of literacy there. The purpose to which people's efforts were put was ultimately salvation, and everybody in the community there was responsible for ensuring that there was commitment to the institution as a place for keeping moral order and political order and things that one would normally associate with the broader political and institutional order on the island. And because of that, everybody was their brother's keeper. Everybody was their sister's keeper. And literacy and being able to preach and being able to serve the community was ubiquitous. It was something that everybody participated in, and it was truly an astounding thing. I once asked an elderly person if she knew anyone that could not read, and she laughed at my question before hearkening back to something that she had encountered decades and decades before as a child. She herself had been through school up through the third grade, but this continual practice of reintegrating people based on their capacity to serve, to preach, to create order through the church was the basis for this widespread literacy. And school was school. School was school as we know it here and as we pretty much know it everywhere else in the world, where people were accountable to showing what they knew, to displaying their knowledge, but doing so for the purpose of getting good grades and hopefully getting off island and maybe getting a job as a bureaucrat with an air-conditioned office. So the purposes of the various orders were quite different. And what became clear to me, and what I think is something we'll get to in the conversation, I hope today, is that situations, systems in which people participate really define what it means to know, and to know something in one place, in one setting, is almost always particular to the norms of that setting, and we see that change between different institutional and cultural orders around the world, yet we're all accountable in some way, whether it's to our families, to our communities, or to our places of work, to be knowledgeable, and that knowledge is on display and being tested in various sorts of ways, but ways that are quite authentic to the purposes of those settings.
Thanks, Vera, for setting a high bar on purpose, salvation and survival. Do you think the purposes of our courses can really match that sense of purpose? But I did want to highlight, and maybe share a little bit of my own personal stakes in all of this, is that, I think both Bill's story and Vera's story are really highlighting how, to borrow from Ed Hutchins' term, learning in the wild just happens as a side effect of engaging in purposeful activity. And, in a lot of ways, people aren't sitting there measuring the learning that's happening in these settings, but it's happening, and how different that is from, formal environments where there's so much of the measuring and accounting going on. And, I'll give two data points. I grew up with a very interest-driven learner who had a somewhat complicated relationship to school, my brother, whereas I call myself the corporate learner. My connected learning environment was actually the school, because I really enjoyed the practices and rituals of schooling and the subjects taught there. And, my brother would just go off and do things on his own, but was clearly, learning a tremendous amount. So that always puzzled me. It was sort of a reference point in a lot of the work that I've been doing on connected learning. And then my own research as an anthropologist, like Vera, I went off and studied learning in the wild, in my case, kids on the internet. And, now we're meeting at this point where, a lot of the learning that, my brother did on his own, his self-directed learning, the learning I see kids doing in their social and recreational lives online, it's clearly there's so much learning happening there, and we don't want to channel it through our modes of counting and sorting and assessment that could shut that naturally occurring and highly divergent and personal learning down. At the same time, I do think as educators, we both want to connect with that learning and connect the in-school and out-of-school learning, which is really core to a lot of what we're advocating in connected learning. But also, as educational researchers, I do feel a responsibility for somehow valuing the kind of learning that may be happening in these more purpose-driven, uh, less content and skills-focused kinds of ways. And I think that's really been an interesting struggle, an interesting research problematic that we've been diving into in the Connected Learning Research Network, and which I'd like to, you know, talk about more in the time we have today, because I do think that as folks who are accountable to institutions and who are trying to tell stories about the social impact of our work, that we have to start developing not only the story and the language for how we describe what young people get out of these experiences, but also the concrete tools that we can use to collaborate and build that evidence base for why this makes a difference in young people's lives. So I did want to encourage folks who are listening and who are on Twitter to feel free to post questions, comments, concerns on the Twitter channel, hashtag #CCourses, and I will do my very best to feed that into the conversation here between the three of us. I have a few questions to start us off with Bill and Vera, but then I hope you'll give us some more fodder for thought on the Twitter feed. So I wanted to start with Vera. Over the years, you've really been educating me about how we might think about the difference between, I think, what you call in-the-head outcomes or in-the-person outcomes and more social and contextual kinds of outcomes. And I think it's pretty challenging for all of us who have grown up with tests and other kinds of assessments, those in-the-head assessments, to really understand what it means to describe and evaluate outcomes that are not located in an individual person. I feel like this distinction tracks in some really important ways to what Mike Wesch in his video for this unit described as the difference between a content-driven and a purpose-driven orientation, and some of the examples that he gave about, what does an outcome look like when it's about changing lives versus pushing content at kids. So can you talk a little bit about this difference and how it relates concretely to the kinds of evaluation and assessment work that you've been involved in?
Sure, and it was great that you mentioned cognition in the wild and the work of Ed Hutchins. I think Gregory Bateson also famously said that memory is half in the head and half in the world, and the notion that when we learn and when we engage in activity, we're actually always part of a system. We're always part of something bigger than ourselves, whether it's engaging in the most intimate moments with text that others have created, or whether it's being part of a collaborative group effort. There's a system at play that we are relying on for much of what we do, and that we're never really sequestered and in a situation where we're solving problems and apart from a system of activity. One of my mentors, Jim Greeno, who's a notable cognitive psychologist, referred to the factoring assumption, that there's a in the head and there's an in the world, and he said we really can never, in our understanding of how people learn, factor the two apart, and that assumption has been tremendously problematic for the world of education. So I really think in terms of learning as experience, and how each and every experience is meaningful only insofar as it can be translated into or applied to new situations, and those experiences are valuable insofar as they promote the likelihood of later uptake of opportunities for learning. So what we really, instead of focusing on a person that we've sequestered apart from the tools and opportunities of the world, want to look at instead are the connections, the way that one experience relates to the next, the way that one experience promotes the possibility of taking up the next, and that next opportunity and the value of that first opportunity, both of the design of both of those learning experiences, the onus is on us. That is, the onus is on those of us who create and design the learning experiences.
Yeah, I think that shift, that was a big aha to me, I think, in one of our conversations, Vera, is really shifting that focus from, blaming the individual
Right.
or the student for the outcome, the failures of, an instructional setting versus, really looking to the instructional setting and what may be missing there as a really important shift in focus. And you really wonder why we assume that kids aren't learning because there's something wrong with them versus there's something wrong with the environment. And it's just an assumption that's so deeply ingrained in how we measure learning that when you think about it, it's fairly commonsensical, but we're so used to that opposite orientation that we have to just work harder in changing the person as opposed to changing the environment. So, Bill, I wanted to see if you could build on that because I know that you've done so much work in really, operationalizing that core
Mhm.
insight. It's such a radical departure so that it's a conceptual thing that I think makes a lot of sense to people, right? But then, practically speaking, it's such a radical departure from our mainstream assessment and testing kind of apparatus in education. Can you describe a little bit of, how do you make the case and how do you put that into practice?
Right. So I'll pick up where Vera left off about the thinking about the opportunities that people have and learning as reciprocally related. So if we assume that, then we actually need to be thinking and measuring both of those things, and we can't measure one and not we can't measure the outcomes without measuring those opportunities somehow and be able to think that, well, we've got a good picture of what's going on here. And I'll give you an example that draws from an activity I do with my undergraduates in an adolescent development class. So we take a question that we use on our connected learning survey that drives a lot. And we ask them, what's something that you did over a long period of time during your adolescence that you really enjoyed doing and that you got better at the more that you did it? And I set this up as a Google form, and they answer it live. And I ask them some other questions about it, like who supported them, where did they pursue it, if you stopped doing it, when did you stop? And then we actually have a discussion immediately. So, and at first, like most of the students, like all of us, they think interest, that's a really idiosyncratic thing. I have my own interests, they're not really like anybody else's, but then they look, and the list is about, usually it's, I would say for more than half of the class, they list a sport that they played in high school. So what's that about? If our interests are all about ourselves, what is it about our world that supports the development of sport as an interest-related learning, where people that's their compelling experience? The other thing they notice is a column about when people stop. There's a large number of 17-year-old and 18 when I stopped doing this. Well, what happened about then? Oh, I went off to school. I stopped having the opportunity to do what I did. So that begins to help people to see that there's this relationship, in the class at least, between interest, this thing I think is really deeply individual, and my opportunity. And so we're taking that very approach in the work that we're doing to measure connected learning and its outcomes by really focusing on young people's experiences, but also the opportunities that they have to pursue different interest-related outcomes. And I think that's really important if we really want to build a system of how we can assess connected learning. We not only need the measures of the outcomes, not only do we need the opportunity measures, but we also need some way of making productive use of those things together. And the name I give to that is like a continuous improvement process. So how do we actually say that this is in the service of getting better at providing opportunities for everyone so that everyone has a chance to find something that they're wonderful at and get better at? And it's very easy if we just focus on assessing outcomes to forget that that's our purpose. And so without measures of outcomes, opportunities, and those integrated into a continuous improvement process, it's just too easy to lose that leg, and we get the kind of accountability systems that we actually find in our schools. So I would say if we really want to reinvent assessment, we've got to think of this as a multi-legged stool that we've got. We've got some work that's actually going on to improve things. We've got some measurement of outcomes. We've got some measures of opportunity and some people who are really trying to coordinate that work together. and do that in a collaborative fashion.
Yeah, that's a great sort of three-part structure to think about. So the opportunities, outcomes, and then the feedback loop to improvement. If we think of that, our practices really need to have all three, and what is missing. I remember, and I think it's that. Well, a lot of us don't have those practices institutionally, but we can certainly get feedback and improve our classes. That seems like it's within our power as faculty. I think it's really capturing the opportunity piece that a lot of us don't do. And I remember, I give workshops to educators about, connected learning and interest-driven learning, and I talk about when you look from the perspective of the learner, Bill, as you were suggesting, like how do you learn? What have you been interested in? The learning ecosystem looks very different than when you're looking from the perspective of the class. And, some of the faculty in my workshop said, well, we don't actually ask our kids what they're interested in or what they're bringing to the class, and maybe we should start with a student interest survey. And it's just these things that it's not part of our practice to ask or to
Mm-hmm.
assess what students have coming into our environments and how our practices in the classroom connect back out. That I think it would be just a really interesting set of common practices if we could build that into our work a little bit more. I want to bring in a question along this line, and Vera and Bill, see if you have other suggestions, is, for just other ways that we can really get at not just the opportunities that kids have coming into the class, but what did they really get out of a more purpose-driven or connected kind of course experience? How would you suggest that faculty might uh, get attuned to those level of outcomes for their students? This is a question from Erin.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one thing I think a reasonable way to think about it is, are students participating or able to participate productively in the kinds of activities that you care about them participating in? And that really means creating an environment where students are actively engaged in doing the kinds of things you ultimately would like them to do, and making observations, whether those observations are in terms of their final product or the kinds of engagement that they demonstrate, vis-a-vis their peers. And it means moving away from the knowledge in the head kind of assumptions about what it means to learn, and instead thinks about participation as the meaningful and productive participation as the core focus for what you want to assess as an educator.
And I would agree with that. And there are certain things that we can look for in that, in terms of the variations and responsibilities that people are able to take on within activities in the class. Like, did they become more able to take on roles flexibly, fill in for other people as is needed to advance the goals of the group? Contribute their own ideas and feel like they have a say in the group. So those are just within the class. And then I think we want to take a long view of the outcomes, not in terms of I'm going to give a test and measure transfer on a transfer task of the content learning, but do kids get to where they want to go next and where they could go next, and maybe where you'd like to encourage them to go next? Meaning, are they, so taking what Vera said earlier about being prepared for the next thing, well, do they go to the next thing? So we have to follow up with our students afterwards, and where did this class lead them? Like physically, literally physically, but also intellectually, emotionally, socially. Did they find their way into new groups? Did they find their new way into new classes that they hadn't thought about before? So we want to actually trace pathways, but do so in a way that's really grounded and not like based in an abstract image of what we think is sort of defined by a syllabus. And so we do want to follow up with students if we really want to understand, did this make a difference in their lives?
Yeah, I'm sort of curious whether, we have so few tools and practices that enable us to know what happened to students over time. I remember when we were in our workshop for planning this connected course, I was kind of pushing on this and saying, well, a lot of these outcomes, they play out over time, right? Just surveying your kids at the end of the course isn't necessarily going to get you to these life-changing outcomes. And a lot of the faculty, because they are highly connected faculty, said that they were actually in touch with their students over social media over long periods of time. And I just was wondering if we could think creatively about, telling the story about what it means to be a faculty person who touches kids' lives in a particular way, but you don't really know what happens a few years down the line because nobody actually studies that. Now, I was, bringing up this, in that context, this large-scale survey that recently came up that was fielded by Gallup and Purdue of, I think they surveyed almost 4,000 college graduates, and they found that the two things that I think doubled or tripled the effect size on life thriving was one, project-based sustained learning, and the other was a meaningful connection to a faculty member. So those are the two things, irrespective of institutional size, selectivity, all these other things that made the biggest difference. And I thought that study was just, both unusual but also very important because it was telling that story, Bill, of what you're saying is like, it's not just what kids got out of the course, it's what happens next that really matters. And we have so few studies that tells that broader story. I wanted to bring in some of the questions from the Twitter channel that is also pointing to some of these themes. From Shelley, she asks, how can we show changing lives in ways that the evidence-based learning outcomes folks will value as important? And from Andrea, too, how can such innovative ideas fit into the assessment regime imposed by the accreditation process? Is there any way of really making that case for the folks who may not have already drunk the Kool-Aid? Any suggestions there?
Well, certainly, hooking onto the project-based learning piece, projects, people produce artifacts as a natural outgrowth of their projects. And if it has an authentic product, then it will definitely have that character to it. So I do think that one can, for people who need evidence from the course itself, we want to look at the qualities of what it is that students are producing. We can also look at these dimensions of participation and develop systematic ways of observing and recording those pieces. So I think that feeds that need in the short term. And I think it's really important to try to actually influence these conversations around changing lives. I mean, I think it just doesn't make sense to talk about changing lives on a semesterly basis. Where certainly life-changing events can happen in a very short period of time, but how they play out is over a longer term. And so if we want to hold ourselves or our colleagues accountable for those outcomes, then we need to really take a longer view of what it is we want to really be judged by and judge our success by.
I do think engaging in conversation with with the powers that be in these regards and helping shape an understanding that even for more traditional classes where outcomes are measured in terms of knowledge, the outcomes are better when shaped around a problem or a project. And I think that that the dialogue really has probably only just begun in higher education, and there's a lot of potential room for reshaping the framing that we see with the assessment and accreditation kinds of regimes as well.
I wanted to bring in some of the interesting comments and thoughtful suggestions coming in from Twitter. So Avi suggests that why don't we flip the conversation so that to really ask if evidence-based learning outcomes changes lives or not. I like that suggestion. Why are we on the defensive here? And just some. Mari suggests, we could modify classes on the go based on student interest. That's a really interesting suggestion. I wonder if any people have done that. I know Howard Rheingold has done a lot of work with his co-learners. I was also reminded of Kathy Davidson's description of what she called her very best course was the one that the students mutinied and
Right.
took over the syllabus. So I think that's a very interesting model to celebrate. I know that it may be beyond the comfort zone of a lot of us who are used to kind of having the plan, which I know I would need to let go of a little bit.
Mhm.
Paul says he's started to incorporate creativity and assessment through podcasts, digital storing, and infographics. So yeah, having the projects tell a different story also does seem like a really productive way to go. And certainly at the core of connected learning, we've been talking about production centered as a
Mhm.
core value set. I wanted to just now that I've invoked Kathy Davidson, I wanted to invoke another thing that she said in the kickoff live event for this unit, where she was really questioning why we have to have failure
Mhm.
at all as a part of our, the structure of our courses. That why can't we just assess when kids have, done something that's worth recognizing and marking? And I was wondering if that is something that has been in the conversation around educational outcomes, if that's something that you've seen practiced or feel like it's practicable at all within formal contexts, is just removing the failure part of the equation.
Mhm. And I think if you want to do that, you have to shift more towards a learning community focus and away a lot from the individual outcome focus that is in our current accountability system. And say, because I think that you have to begin to think about how can different people contribute to a project or to a shared purpose in their own way, and certainly, and what are the systems that we have to set up so that people are supported in making those and identifying what they can contribute, and sometimes actually normed into doing so. I'm really struck by, I'm always brought back to Ray McDermott's question of why we and how we produce failure, but also the converse image of this is offered actually in Lave and Winger's vision of apprenticeship, which my colleagues Kevin O'Connor and Annie Allen so wonderfully pointed out. The beauty of a lot of those stories is that nearly everybody gets brought into some kind of productive future, and so, but there's an attention to how is the master or the people who are more skilled, how are they bringing people into their future, and that there's an accountability to that if we want to not produce failure, to say we really have, if we want everybody to contribute, it's everyone's job actually to try to figure out how can we elicit the contributions of each person to the community's project or the class's project in a formal educational system, and then recognize them for those accomplishments.
We might see changes where students cycle in and out of the university system or the higher ed system based on what their needs and their growth trajectories are, and that may be one of the structural changes we see based on this, based on a system that really is awarding credits, as it were, when students achieve something, but not penalizing them for not having achieved. It's a little bit of a common saying: nobody's ever failed at a museum or failed at a family based on what you know or don't know, and school really doesn't have to be that way, according to the theorists we like, including Ray McDermott, who's influenced all three of us, I know.
I've just been monitoring the Twitter stream. There's a lot of good questions coming through there. Maybe I'll pull on this thread. Some folks are asking about just I think, Bill, it's partially in response to your uh, suggestion that you solicit some narratives of young people's interest development.
Mm-hmm.
So what the interest development piece is interesting is challenging in a lot of ways, because we're negotiating that tension between wanting to meet young people where they are, but also trying to introduce them to new things. And it's that relationship between the interest being a personal passion versus something that's provided by the environment, I think. So Maha Learning asks, how have those interests developed? How can we provide opportunities for new interests and
Mm-hmm.
purposes?
Mm-hmm.
And Dan also asks how much of the engagement equation depends on students finding their own introspective sense of purpose. Is this something that's valued within youth culture?
Mm. Yeah, so I think that's a great set of questions about interest cultivation, and I'm certainly reminded of Dewey's thoughts on interest development, which really interest is the beginning point, but the idea of cultivating an interest is you don't know where it's going to go. And so our interests are really a starting point, and we really do need experiences of various kinds that allow us to learn in order to deepen them, so develop knowledge related to our interests. To engage with others in relation to our interests, to find out what others are interested in, and to be able to perhaps do something with them. And I think interests evolve. So and I think new interests emerge from this deep engagement. And the move here, though, is to begin with those interests and say, how do we cultivate them? How do we deepen them? And expect that they're going to go off in some unexpected directions. If we provide a way for people to really deepen and get smarter about their interests and engage with others in them.
Yeah, and it does seem like, some of the uh, kinds of courses that, Mike Wesch described, about that Josipa described, about getting young people into new and novel kinds of projects and environments that they wouldn't have otherwise had exposure to, is just a really concrete way of, getting kids to cultivate new interests. So, there's a lot of what I see as these sort of quizzes of, your personal passion finder, which is all about asking what's in your head or in, whereas, the personal passion finder should be getting thrown into a lot of environments where you can see how you react to a set of novel situations that may not be part of your existing culture and practice. And I feel like that's really, the job of education is exposure to novel, new environments, stimulus, people, not, telling kids to pick and then buckle down on an existing pathway. And we visited the folks at Road Trip Nation, which is this really fabulous public TV series where kids just go around in an RV and interview people about how they got where they did, and their motto is define your road in life, and really just impressing on young folks that pathway comes from a lot of exploring and trying things out. And in educational environments, I feel like that's the one time in your life where you really have license to do that. So I was inspired by some of the examples that were raised earlier in this unit. I wanted to bring in a question from Alan, which is a good one, where he's saying, does everything have to be measured to affirmed? Do you need to quantify love to feel loved? So, I think he's suggesting that there's also this, not necessarily a downside, but why do we have to measure this stuff? I think it's a good question.
And we live most of our lives in environments where what we've learned and what we know how to do is not overtly measured, that the measurements are sort of seamlessly built into the activity between people in that environment. Most workplaces are structured that way, so it's not such an odd or exotic way of thinking about learning proceeding and being sort of implicitly understood. We are always implicitly understanding one another and what one another's capacities and capabilities are, and even in subtle ways setting one another up to see whether they're up to a particular task or not. But that's a very functional human thing to do, and it's very different from the way we think about assessment in schools.
Another thing that I'm reminded of with that comment is a really powerful model of assessment in early childhood that's associated with the Reggio Emilia method. And it's a different way of it's not measurement, it's called documentation. And one of the functions of documentation is to connect parents and children to the learning of the children through narrative, through pictures, through film. And that becomes a shared object among the teacher, child, parent, and community for reflection. And if we think of the functions of documentation and picture taking in our lives, it is to share our love. So, and I think in the Reggio Emilia, it isn't just to document learning or difficulties associated with learning, but really to connect and bring people together. And here's a school-based model of assessment that sits in front of us and can be observed in any number of communities. But it's interesting that it doesn't get taken up in K-12 or in higher education. But it is one that actually meets a lot of the requirements of parents wanting to know, well, what's happening with my child? How are they growing? How can I connect into that and support that in a way that's not about measurement, but about documentation and providing a documentation that does indeed serve as evidence of learning. But it's definitely not in the measurement paradigm.
There's a lot of interesting work, of course, being done with portfolios and e-portfolios now in higher education, and that's essentially the same model, Bill, as you've mentioned. And it's great to think of that as a way of students both charting what they've done, planning what they want to do, thinking about what evidence is for themselves, and then sharing that with others.
Yeah, no, I think it's great to point to the portfolio and project-based side of things because so many of our faculty, I think, are really oriented towards the making and producing things. And I love just the idea that instead of assessment, we talk about shared objects of reflection. You know, what if we reframe the conversation about assessment around that? I wanted to insert in this a comment by Sylvia is that, yeah, we actually do have to measure this stuff so employers know what we can do. Not everyone has the time and luxury of learning only what you like. And I think that's a really great reminder that, you know, we're not just talking about discretionary and recreational learning. You know, this has real life consequences for people. And some of the more performance and portfolio-based stuff, I think, is actually more persuasive, you know, in the real world than the, you know, bubble tests and the numbers and the you know, GPAs, which I think Richard and Josipa last week really demonstrated that because of all the grade inflation and so on happening in higher ed, those things don't really hold as much weight as, you know, whether you can really do something or have created something that's impressive. So, you know, that may be a, you know, one possible wedge into changing the conversation about assessment in higher ed. I wanted to insert a question from Jackie. She's asking, you know, why is school success based on what we know or don't know?
Yeah, why?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that is a sorting and selecting function of schools. So, I mean, to me, one of the reasons that we produce failure based on knowledge and not knowledge is that pretty efficient at actually helping us reproduce class, race, hierarchies that exist in society today, and partly because we're ignoring the opportunity side of that. And so, like, as I said earlier, if you suddenly couple those with opportunity data and think about, and also the purposes of assessment and make those much more conscious and about improvement as opposed to sorting and selecting, then I think, you know, it's not so problematic that we measure what people know or don't know. What's problematic is we don't also attend to these other issues like opportunity and the purposes that we're using assessment for.
Yeah, I was wondering when the sorting and function of education was going to come up, and I do think that, you know, that's just something that we have to, as, you know, participants in this system, really just recognize and take to heart that, you know, whether it's college admissions or grading kids in elementary school, that one of the functions of education is the sorting of, you know, students into different life opportunities. And, you know, the traditional models of assessment are quite effective for doing that. And you know, we can have a conversation about the kind of assessment that improves our teaching, the continuous improvement model, Bill, that you talked about. as well as, the kinds of assessments that we just think are right in telling a story about what kids should be getting about education. But unless we really confront the fact that traditional assessments perform this very, socially important function, we'll play the social scientist here, it's really difficult to get past, I think what's been percolating in this conversation, the reason why these alternative stories don't get as much traction is because of, this constant, uh, you know, arms race and issues of selectivity and sorting and status negotiations that our institutions of higher education are part of. But I don't want to end with the downer here. So, um, you know, I, um, I did want to, before we close this session, return to some of the practical, actionable things. I do want to underline the fact that we are in higher education, I think, in a moment of opportunity. Like we heard from Richard and Josipa last week. There's a lot of change happening. A lot of it is driven by, the disruption conversation or the tech conversation. A lot of it is driven by economics, but there's a growing recognition that, we need to be looking at different kinds of measures of success, of outcomes, that higher education is poised to really make some major changes, I think, in the way that instruction happens, the use of technologies. I did want to ask both of you, where do you see some of the opportunities in relation to, all the talk about technology and network and open and MOOCs, and also, maybe some of the opportunities that are really there to be able to tell a story about the unique kinds of outcomes that come from a more connected, social, progressive, purpose-driven, however we want to frame it, kind of learning experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that mentioning the documentation orientation and assessment is really a powerful and a potent one. And I love a phrase that's been bantered about at Stanford a little bit, declaring a mission, not a major, which I think has a lot of resonance. That really, if students are on a trajectory of finding what they can feel they can most meaningfully bring to the world in terms of their capacities and their understanding, knowledge, and abilities, then that relationship between the documentation and the outcomes in their lives is quite tight and quite nice. So I think we moved to that point of the conversation, and that is an upper.
Mm-hmm. One thing I think Vera mentioned, that a lot of practices of assessment and evaluation are embedded within formal practices. I know Lissa Soep has written a lot about critique in the context of youth radio production, and the value of group critique of young people's developing stories. And part of its power is it's really embedded in support of young people's own goals, but it also develops and evolves a set of critical standards for what constitutes a good story in their case. In every higher education course, there are critical standards of quality work that faculty would like to inculcate, and that part of the challenge in assessment is helping the students actually adopt critical standards for their work. And the power of technology is to be able to crowdsource some of this, and to continually revise community and develop and revise community standards for what is good work in this class. What does it mean for us to think hard with each other and advance one another's learning? And to use technology to enable people joint review of work, of the documentation, but also the rubrics that go with that. So the rubrics don't have to come from on high, but they can evolve from the class based on its own learning. And then that becomes part of the portfolio of evidence that you gather. And again, technology makes this possible with very large classes to do, and to be able to crowdsource, aggregate, look at pairwise kinds of comparisons and then actually make use of those to surface, oh, this is quality work by lots of different pairs. What are the qualities that are evident in here that we can actually surface that we agree, that it seems like lots of people in the class agree are important and valued. So to me, that fits within the existing frame of constraints that we have, but also the technology affordances that we have today in higher ed.
That's great. I love the mission, not a major. I gotta think about that. Yeah, the Bill, what you're saying, I think there's been some discussion, in the follow-up of the conversation with Richard and Josipa, where Josipa was saying that we need more rigor, in classes, that we're just letting kids off too easy, in a way. But then there's been a lot of discussion about how do you inculcate rigor in a context of these more progressive and co-learning kinds of environments that we're trying to create. And I think what you just described is a really nice model for how to do that. I think it's hard to do, but I see that when I look at really high-functioning online interest groups, they do develop these community standards that are very, very high, and because they're created together and collaboratively and maintained together, the level of legitimacy, the level of buy-in, the level of engagement is so different than, just a faculty member saying, here's the standard and you're going to fail if you don't meet it, that the stance is completely different. And I think it really, I'm learning a lot from this connected course and the kind of emerging value set that we're developing together, but that is, I think, the model that is really resonant with our value system. So, I like that vision of the community standards. I know we're running out of time, and before we end, I did want to talk a little bit about the student survey that we designed and to make a pitch for participation. So something really concrete, and it's kind of a crazy idea, but it's something that could, really help us tell the story that we're trying to tell. So as a research nerd, I'm thinking about not just how fun it is to be co-learners with this incredible network of faculty as part of connected courses, but about how, as we're going along, can we start documenting some of what's happening, and then after we all go off and start teaching our connected courses, how can we gather some of what is happening in those courses in ways that may enable us to make a case down the line, not just in that one course, but in aggregate and also over time, about the difference that it makes to teach this way. And so Bill, Vera, Amanda, Richard Aram also helped. We put together a survey based on some existing instruments, including the National Survey of Student Engagement, which a lot of the colleges and universities that everybody is part of have probably surveyed the kids already these items, as well as items that come from the Connected Learning Research Network survey that Bill and Vera have been involved in developing and fielding. And so it's a survey with a bank of items that looks at things that aren't going to be assessed based on the more traditional kinds of student feedback forms or on the skills and outcomes kind of thing that you may be assessing or accountable to, depending on what you teach already. But it's looking at, are kids engaged? Did they feel purposeful? Did they connect with others? Did they share their stuff online? Things that are really specific to the model of what we're trying to pursue in connected courses. And with the Connected Learning Research Network, again, we're trying to develop things that are easy to ask, like, did you connect with somebody? Did you, connect with an expert in your area of interest? These are not, things that have to go in and ask a ton of questions about the secret sauce of some personality or, extract things from kids' heads. These are pretty straightforward things you can ask your students about the experience in your course. I think it's only a 20-minute survey, I think. What did it come to, Bill and Vera? Is that about right? About 20 minutes.
Sounds about right.
So we have it online. It's linked from the main Connected Courses site for this calendar entry for this webinar, and also on on the main, Unit 1 page. We'd really welcome feedback. And if you're interested, I mean, you don't have to make a commitment now, but if you're interested in sort of being on the roster for potentially fielding the survey with your students after your course, we have a sign-up form. We'd love to have you, you know, participate in this and be part of this experiment and seeing if we see any interesting comparisons between connected courses and more traditional courses. And if it all goes well, we could have a big set of data that we could, of course, share with this community. We would, of course, share the outcomes of your specific class to you, so you can get specific feedback on your course. And, all with an eye towards just encouraging all of us to put a little bit of effort into starting to think about documenting non-traditional outcomes and maybe even following up with these students down the line. So that was our thinking of, trying to take the opportunity that we have with this really unique network of faculty to do something together that is actionable and may help us make a story about why our universities should be supporting these kinds of courses. So that's my plea for the survey. I'll let Vera and Bill close it out by either filling more in on the survey or, saying any last words on this topic.
Bill, you're the survey master. You've done so much work on the one that for the Connected Learning Research Network, but it was a wonderful experience. Thank you all for your comments and input, and I'll sign off here.
Yeah. So just a plug for the survey too. So one of the things that I can say about it is we've tested a lot of these items for how they align to the connected learning features or design principles. And so they're mapped and connected into that, and we have some good evidence that they work well, at least with a younger population. So this is more for, we developed them for younger teens, and so it'll be really interesting to see how they work out in higher education setting. And just thanks for the opportunity to participate and contribute to your course today. So thanks, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Bill and Vera, and thanks for everybody who had such a great conversation and good questions on the Twitter channel as well. I look forward to continuing the conversation, and yeah, let's keep the energy going on all the ongoing channels. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.